Well, have you ever looked at the birds in your backyard and wondered if they're the same ones that you saw yesterday? Is that particular scrub wren one that lives here year round, or is there a rotating cast of different individuals and family groups from one week to the next? These questions are very hard to answer, and one of the techniques that researchers use is to catch birds and fit them with little leg bands. It's important to have a hobby, and my guest today is someone who takes his hobby very seriously. Dr. Jon Coleman is an IT professional from 9 to 5, but outside of work, he leads teams of citizen scientists out to rugged mountain tops and remote parts of Western Queensland to catch and band birds. It's all part of an epic research effort investigating the life history of birds across the state. Jon has helped establish 30 long-term monitoring sites in Queensland where over 46,000 birds have been banded, collecting a colossal amount of data on scores of different species. So, Jon, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
And you're speaking to us from Queensland. I understand you come from a long line of bird banders in the UK. So is this a hereditary kind of thing? Can you tell us about your early experiences catching and banding birds?
Yeah, it kind of is really, and my daughter's experiencing the same now. But my parents worked with birds all of their throughout their careers, exactly the same. They worked in different fields and did it as a hobby. My father got a British Empire Medal, in fact, for his work on swans, and pretty much every childhood memory I have involves birds in some way. Normally swans, normally being smaller than everyone, being pecked and battered by them. But other great experiences as a kid, being in heronries, banding heron chicks, misnetting small birds. So yeah, I feel very fortunate to have had that upbringing.
Yeah, wow. And just to talk us through that process. So, as a little kid going out to help your
Mm.
your parents band swans, these very large birds, what's that like? They're, like you said, bigger than you as a kid.
Mm.
So, what do they like to handle? How do you go about actually catching a swan?
Yeah, it's a little bit different to catching a silver eye or a honey eater with a mist net. They are bigger, therefore it requires two hands and the whole arm to grab hold of them. Particularly the ones in the UK, the mute swans, because they're weighing anything from 8 to 15 kilos. So it's a big bird. But as here, they're very popular with the public. They're quite tame. You can walk and pick up individuals just with a bit of seed or something, or a slice of lettuce, and they'll bend down and you pick them up. You can corner groups of them, family groups against a fence or in an inlet, and catch them that way. And in the summer, not so much of a thing here because black swans molt all year round, but in the summer in the UK, they gather in huge flocks and drop their flight feathers. So we used to round them up with canoes in flocks of anywhere between 200 and 600 birds into an
Wow.
enclosure on the bank, and then a team of 40 or 50 people processing and banding. So yeah, very different to normal banding, that's for sure.
That's a great visual, sort of herding swans with canoes. I imagine it'd be cold over there too.
It can be, yeah. One of the good things about coming to Australia was reintroducing myself to warmth and sunlight,
Hmm.
a very different kind of field work.
So this is a technique that it's really interesting because it does allow you to get that sort of individualized
Yeah,
data to say this bird is the same one as we caught however long ago, last week, last year, a few years ago. And
absolutely.
there's a whole lot of questions you can answer by doing that. Let's just start with how you actually go through that process. So what's a typical morning on one of these banding sites?
Yeah, so I mean, if I take Bowra as an example for that, the morning actually starts the previous day. So when we go to our sites, we try to do the same things each month, each year, so that we build up consistent long-term data sets on what the birds are doing. So we'll typically set 10 to 15 nets at a site. We'll do that just after lunch. We'll net from around about 2 o'clock till dusk. We'll close the nets then overnight. reopen them at dawn, net till about 11 o'clock, and then take them all down, quick break, and then repeat. And at Bowra, we'll do that for 10 days straight. So that's, 12, 13, 14-hour days,
Wow.
continuous for 10 days. So it's hard work, but you're outside, it's rewarding. You learn very quickly that there's not too much wrong with your health,
Mm.
because it really is quite taxing and tiring at times.
Mm.
But it's great, and you see a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just being outside at that sort of dawn and dusk time, that's when everything is most active. The,
Absolutely.
the nets you were describing, so this is not sort of handheld, chasing after birds with a net. These
No,
are actually fixed in place. Talk us through those nets and then what happens.
yeah,
Sort of, do birds just fly into them by
yeah,
chance? And
yeah.
how do you select where to set them up at each site?
Yeah, so the selection process is more of an art than a science. You're typically looking for trying to put yourself into the mind of a bird. Where would a bird fly, and why would it fly in a certain direction or area? Is there a fruiting tree? Is there a tree that's unusual that might be a focal point for birds? And we'll typically set nets around those areas. Water's another good one, particularly in arid areas, sort of on entry points where birds might be flying through vegetation coming in. The nets they're passive capture, so we'll have a team of 5 to 6 people managing nets, and they are 12 feet long, 2.5 meters tall, incredibly fine netting, which is why they're called mist nets. And the birds are just flying around doing their thing. They fly in, they fall into a little pocket in the net, and then I will have teams of people constantly circulating those nets quietly. And as birds go in, they'll put them in a small bag to keep them calm and bring them back to a base where they're banded, measured, and weighed. So it's sort of a production line that goes on for the whole day.
Right. And it must be, one of the considerations must be extracting the birds relatively soon after they've flown
Mm,
into the net, I imagine. What are the sort of welfare considerations
yeah,
for the animals that you're handling?
yeah. So welfare is a huge thing, and people are picked to do this very much based on their attitudes towards wildlife. Training is very extensive, field based, so there is a rigorous training program under the Australian Bird and Bat Banding Scheme. So anybody that's handling birds is either extremely experienced or has or is under very close supervision while they're learning. We try to get birds out of nets quickly, as you said, so that we minimise stress, and we band and process quickly. And then there's a number of other things around that process to make sure that it's appropriate. We shouldn't be catching and handling wildlife unless there's good reason for it. So there is not only the permitting system, which looks at the scientific processes that we're working through, but also a process called ethics, which I'm actually one of the things I'm most supportive of in our permitting, because that's a group of people. There's scientists, there's welfare people, there are members of the public on those committees, and you have to pitch and say, this is what I'm doing, this is why it's important, this is how we make sure that the animals, the birds in this case, are being managed so that they're safe and protected while we're working with them. And that committee has to authorize the work. And if it doesn't, your work cannot go ahead.
Mm.
And then there are a whole bunch of reporting frameworks around that to make sure that things are done appropriately. So
Mm.
it is taken very seriously, and it's a good question to ask because people do worry about that.
Yeah. So processing all these birds as they're flying into the
Mm,
nets, you must have quite a big team sometimes. Who are
yeah.
these people? Who are the people that join in on your banding expeditions?
Yeah, so pretty much all volunteers. They come from all walks of life. They all have one thing in common, an absolute passion for wildlife and, in particular, birds. And we do attract people from, all over the world. We've had people come to Bowra from as far as Canada, Europe. I think we've had one South American there. We've had people from Asia. It pulls people in, but they're pretty much all volunteers, and they all have to go through that training and registration. So it's a lot that they do. And of course, when we're at Bowra, we also get well represented by the ecologists at AWC, and that's great. That gives us another dimension. They get to learn a little bit about handling birds, but we actually get so much out of having them along with us because they know the sites, they know the wildlife, they know the plants, um, and it makes it a great experience for everybody, as well as the knowledge we gain.
Yeah, and that data is contributed to sort of AWC's eco health framework and keeping track of populations over time.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think last year was the first year that that started being reported in there, and
Yeah.
it's great to see it being used in that way to look at the management and an ongoing protection of the sites.
Mm. I'd like to delve a little bit into the sort of information you can get using this technique. So you're able to individualize birds because you can say this is the same one as last time. What sort of information does that unlock about these birds?
Yeah, the list is almost endless there, and the bands they're remarkably enduring. It was a chap called Hans Cornelius Mortensen over 100 years ago that put a band on a starling in Copenhagen, I think it was, in Denmark, and even after all that time, bands are still generating enormous amounts of data despite all the complementary technologies like satellite telemetry and geolocation and all of that. um, Typically though, for a metal band like this, which is a band that you would put on a swan, you have to catch the bird to read that. We've also got bands like this, which are coded bands that you can read many times without ever touching the bird again. So you can do so much, whether it's monitoring individuals to look at their lifetime reproductive success, looking at local or migratory movements of individual or cohort groups, um, even looking at impacts to individuals of things like climate change. Is their condition changing over time? Um, Longevity. How long do birds live? And does that change? And then when we get lots of recaptures of birds, and that's really the principle behind our main project, generating lots of data and recaptures, you can estimate survival rates in birds. So you can get this whole raft of information looking at individual traits and extrapolating that out to get an indication of overall population health that you can trend, monitor, and take conservation actions against when you see things differing from the norm.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess that sort of highlights the importance of long-term data sets going back
Yeah.
to the same sites year on year. It sounds like a sort of rich trove of data
Oh,
from this technique.
yeah, and it just gets richer with every year you add to those data sets. That's the beauty of them.
Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of times in the field, people will ask, and how old do you think that bird is? How old do you think that
Yeah,
animal is? It's actually a really difficult thing to find out. And, there's not actually that much information for the vast majority of species. We don't know that much about, those life history questions that are
yeah.
kind of fundamental to population dynamics. Um, yeah, so it's interesting that this does sort of provide an answer to that question that is it's quite often top of people's minds. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's so much we just don't know about Australian birds, particularly. A
Mm,
lot of focus on rare and birds of conservation concern.
mm,
Not always a great deal of focus on the common bird. So the obvious question is, do you study it while it's common? So when something happens and it's not so common, you've got that background of data
mm.
to be able to work out what to do.
Yeah, yeah, the idea of surveillance monitoring, I guess,
Yeah,
you've got a solid baseline, and when things differ, that's when we can investigate
yeah,
further. So, what are some of the other research questions that you're looking at through the banding that you're doing across
yeah.
Queensland? 'Cause you've led this kind of resurgence of bird banding across the state, which is very impressive and vast in scale. Um, what are you trying to find out?
Yeah, so the Queensland Bird Research and Banding Group, which we've sort of formed to now coordinate all of this activity better, we've got three core programs of work. So we do work on shorebirds with the Queensland Wader Study Group. And there we're looking at trying to understand what's driving population declines in shorebirds, particularly migratory birds. And we need so much more detail on their behavior, their movements, their life histories. So we're working there with universities, using leg flag resightings to look at survival rate issues and what we might do about that. We're using satellite telemetry to better understand not just the migratory movements of these birds, but their local movements, so that we could look at home ranges and then actually understand the threats that those birds have got in all of those different locations in their flyway. And again, working with people in academia and elsewhere to work out what to do. We have a water bird program, a waterfowl program. Um, that's really just focused around the swans at the moment, which I was showing you the bands on earlier. We've got around about 1,500 bands on the Gold Coast, on swans on the Gold Coast, and we're building up really detailed life histories to understand the mechanisms of breeding in these birds. What we know is only a very small proportion of them produce most of the output into the next generation,
Mm.
and just trying to understand why that is and what that actually means in terms of the population dynamics for a species like that.
Mm.
And then the final one, which is relevant to Bowra and Brooklyn, is our land bird program, which is what we've just been talking about, capturing basic population data for common species across a whole range of different bioregions and habitats throughout Queensland and northern New South Wales. Yeah, we use age ratios as an indirect measure of productivity for each year. We weigh birds, so we've got an idea of body condition. Catch rates give us an idea of abundance, and then we talked about recaptures and survival rates earlier.
Mm.
And that's the project that we've extended into Bowra and Brooklyn.
Mm.
So yeah, so again, monitoring long-term health in bird populations, and working out what we need to do to address anything adverse that gets found in those things.
Mm. Yeah, really important stuff, really important questions to be addressing. So let's take a look at Bowra. This is AWC Sanctuary in southwestern Queensland, close to the town of Cunnamulla. There's been some banding activity there since 2013. And as you said, it's now part of that network of
Yeah.
land bird sites where you go every year or multiple times a year.
Every year. So we
Yeah,
go at Easter every year.
right. And what are some of the birds there? So this is it's kind of arid, like mulga plain, or I guess semi-arid mulga woodland habitat. What are the birds that you're catching in the nets at Bowra?
Yeah, so we've got there's three groups of birds or guilds that we work with at Bowra. We've got the nectarivores, so the honey eaters, white-plumed honey eaters on the riparian corridors, and then some of those more arid country birds singing and spiny-cheeked. We've got the granivores, so the finches, the zebra finches that come and go, budgerigars, and the doves, yeah, peaceful and diamond doves that are out there. And then we've got the insectivores, which are those more specialized birds for the arid country that we find in the mulga, the thornbills, the tree creepers, and so on. So a lot of birds. We've caught, I think, over 100 species of bird out there over our time, or very close to, and certainly seen well over 100 species. And we've managed to monitor them through periods of dry, intense dry, and wet now. So we've got some really good insights into how birds respond.
That's such a sort of characteristic of the arid zone in Australia is that the wet and dry periods are
Yeah,
not predictable. And we were having a bit of a chat before the call just about
yeah,
how different Australia is in how birds, we don't have those consistent seasons, but instead it's sort of multi-year cycles of wet and dry.
yeah.
Um, so what is the data telling you about how birds at Bowra respond to those conditions?
They respond in different ways. If I start with the granivores, that the differences are probably the most profound there in birds like budgerigars and zebra finches. They are either present in enormous numbers or they're completely absent. And they reappear incredibly quickly in large numbers. So these birds just procreate. They're almost like avian insects. They just reproduce at an enormous rate and form food for other birds. Um, the zebra finches are the most extreme example of that. Double-barred finches seem to hang on and they decline slowly over time and then reappear slowly over time. So even there are some differences. The nectarivores, things like spiny-cheeked honey eaters, they just disperse and move on. So we catch a lot less of them in the dry periods. The riparian honey eaters, so white-plumed honey eaters, they hang on, they tough it out. And what we saw through the last really dry period was quite worrying, actually. They definitely started to struggle over time. Their body condition dropped, their breeding success declined, and at the very worst, when Bowra was almost completely dry, we saw the numbers dropping off quite rapidly as well. And they've been recovering slowly since then. And we're only just now back to what I'd call our normal numbers of white-plumed honey eaters there again.
Mm,
And then the insectivores, they just seem to be adapted to it. They seem to be able to deal with anything. You see the same fluctuations, but they're just minor variations over time.
mm.
So very different things
Yeah.
occurring.
And yeah, unpicking the patterns for each of those guilds of birds with
Mm,
their, their particular, I guess, diet is a big part
mm,
of it. So, what their food source is doing in response to conditions. But then, yeah, looking at that over multiple cycles of wet and dry,
mm.
that's great. Bowra is interesting because it's at the edge of it's near kind of the limits of the range for a lot of eastern birds, but also inland birds. So all sorts of things can turn up there. I know just this week they've had a red wattlebird out there, which is the
You're
first
kidding
bird
me.
of Bowra. What's the most exciting or sort of unexpected bird that you've caught at Bowra yourself?
Yeah, the most unexpected is a bird that anyone who's joined this webinar from the East Coast would go, really, and shrug their shoulders. But I think it was 2 years ago on one of the little riparian corridors, we caught a black-faced monarch, which is so far away from its normal habitat
Mm,
and so far away from anywhere within its normal range.
mm.
It was such an unusual record that I went and grabbed the guy that was running the team at the site and went, "Are you joking?" And he went, "I knew you'd ask that. I took photos
Right.
and showed photos." But yeah, just and it just shows how unpredictable birds can be,
Mm.
with weather, with vagrancy, with dispersal. But yeah, that I still think about that bird and go, the poor thing. How did it end up out there?
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah, and that again just shows the value of doing that
Mm,
surveillance, that you're not only seeing what's there regularly, but picking up those unusual
that's right.
movements might not have been recorded, redrawing the map for, for some of
Yeah.
these birds.
Yeah, and for some, it'll be looking at range expansion over time
Mm.
as climate change moves birds around. I
Mm.
doubt we'll see black-faced monarchs there too soon, but other birds, some of the other honey eaters, may well start expanding or contracting ranges over time.
Really interesting. So from Bowra, which is sort of semi-arid southwest Queensland, to the other end of the state, so the north in the wet tropics, and Brooklyn
Yeah,
Wildlife Sanctuary, which is kind of between the Daintree and the northern part of the Atherton Tableland. So it extends across this
yeah,
incredible gradient from very high rainfall, high altitude rainforest and almost cloud forest clad mountains out into dry tropical woodlands in the western part of the property. One of your sites is in that cloud forest area on Mount Lewis at the top of Brooklyn. I know
that's right.
some of the keen bird watchers on the call will have been there to see a particular finch.
Yep.
Um, Tell us about working in that environment. Just, what's it like? What's the landscape like?
Yeah, well, the leeches make it very different to Bowra, that's for sure.
Uh-huh.
It's also it's a really fascinating environment because it can be incredibly cold up there as well, because of the altitude. The weather's also very, very different to what it is down low. And yes, occasionally there are trees down that make it difficult even getting into the site, as you can see on that photograph. Um, but it's very, very different also in terms of the birds to Bowra. We don't see any of that volatility I was just talking about at Bowra. Much more stable bird populations there.
Yeah, and setting up to work in the rainforest. Rainforests are always difficult for
Mm.
field work. So what's your setup there? How do you sort of make it work logistically?
Yeah, so fortunately, the access to the site is quite good. And with the rainfall, the first thing we'll do is set a cover up, so that we've got somewhere dry, both to manage birds, and keep the equipment dry. Um, Fortunately, there are some trails, so the parrotfinch clearing that's there we're able to go around the edges of that and into the forest. So that gives us one site. There's a creek line near there that we also walk along and net, so that gives us the access into the forest. And then we've got the walking trail that goes from the clearing up as well, which is a third of the third site that we run there. So that's good. We're not having to haul our way through thick ground cover in the forest. But the key is to get cover very quickly so that you've got some shelter from the elements.
Mm.
It's called rainforest for a reason,
Yeah.
and Brooklyn seems to get more than its fair share of it. So
Yeah, it's sort of the peak for biodiversity for a lot of different groups. I think for
yeah,
birds, it's one of the, among the most biodiverse regions for sure in
yes.
Australia. So, lots of different groups and lots of species from lots of different groups. What are some of the species you catch there? So I've got a few photos here, and I'll try and let's start with the grey-headed robin. Can you tell us a bit about this species?
Yeah, so that's the really common robin that we get in that area, and it occurs all through the wet tropics at those sort of altitudes in rainforest. That's one of the commonest birds that we catch there, and that again is one of the birds we target there because we catch them in large enough numbers to get good recaptures, to be able to look at things like juvenile proportions, catch rates, and survival rates with some meaning. The other specialists that we catch there are fern wren,
Mm.
Atherton scrub wren, so those real high altitude specialists, mountain thornbill. And then the nectarivores, we've got bridled honeyeater, which is another wet tropic speciality, and Lewin's honeyeater up there. And Lewin's is great because we catch those from Brooklyn all the way down as far south as the Border Ranges National Park in New South Wales. So we not only get then to look at how birds are differing, over time, we get to see how they're differing over different regions and bioregions.
Mm.
And it's such a large area, we can even see Bergman's rule in operation. The
Mm.
Lewis honeyeaters down here are far bigger than they are up at Brooklyn, and we have to have different measurement criteria for establishing males from females between the two places. Um, but yeah, it's very stable though. And if we look at what's happening there compared to Bowra, um, things don't change dramatically over time. We see some evidence of altitudinal migration, so some lower catch rates in the winter, and we're seeing some small declines occurring in some of those species. But again, we need a few more years' data to know if that's really genuine or not.
Yeah, one of the high altitude rainforest
Yeah,
specialists, the golden bowerbird, stunning birds.
yeah,
Um, and there has been concern that climate change would drive some of these high altitude specialists, that their habitat would contract upwards with
yeah,
altitude until that sort of ran out. They ran out
yeah.
of mountaintop to fly to. Have you observed any of that climate signal yet, or is it just too short a data set at this point?
I don't think we've got a big enough data set just yet. And I don't think we should read too much into those slow declines that we've seen just yet as a result. It would be easy to get alarmist, but I do worry. We're going to see one of two things there as other species start to move up those slopes as it gets warmer. One or two things is going to happen. Those birds are either going to adapt, those specialists, and we're going to monitor that adaptation over time, or we're going to be monitoring potential extinction in some of those birds. And the former gives me some hope. The latter is a pretty despairing concept to think about. And it's actually really hard to think about what you might be able to do to counteract that as well, given how specialist the habitat and those species are.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a lot of the monitoring that AWC focuses on is threats where we
Mm,
are able to intervene, in a relatively straightforward way, whether it's, removing feral herbivores,
yeah,
trying to control feral predators, or changing fire patterns. But with climate change in an environment like this, yeah, the data will be really, really important just to tell us
mm,
exactly what's happening. But yeah, the
yeah.
intervention is much less straightforward on that scale.
That's right, yeah. But I think the key is understand what's going on, and then at least you've got a base of data to discuss
Yeah.
and formulate some theories on. That's just, we're talking there just about new species coming in and out competing birds. We also need to think about the impacts of increased cyclone frequency and ferocity as well. Up at Iron Range National Park, we're just monitoring the results of the 2018 cyclone there and the impact that's having on birds. It's taken them a long time to recover.
Mm.
And so, all of these things are a cause for concern. And we need to start thinking about how we might tackle some of those things.
Yeah. I'm interested actually. So yeah, those big threats, very, very scary. But what about the trends that we might be able to pick up
Mm.
where it does tell us something about management, about the land management that might be
Yep.
helpful? Is there data from the stuff that you're collecting that could be informative to, the sorts of conservation programs that AWC can roll out to address some of those threats?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the $1 million question, because why do all of this if you're not able to do that? And generate information that can help the birds. And we've seen, there are even things in the face of climate change that that are not a cause for downing tools and despairing. If we take Bowra, there is some work that hopefully is going to be published soon there, looking at the dry period and the compounding effects of not only low rainfall but really high temperatures, which caused far more evaporation than normal and basically dried the site out completely for a period. From the banding, we were able to see how birds responded to that and moving around and how far they would move for water, and other such things. So, and really, water's a key thing for them in those periods. So there are things that can be done. We know that the water bodies there are an absolute lifeline.
Mm.
So knowing how far birds will go means that you could look at where you might supplement water around a site. We also know, you mentioned ferals, but at Bowra, managing feral animals seems to have benefited. The grass and the seed production there seems to be so much richer now than in the first years we went. Again, I don't know why, but that may be a result of there being more seed available to germinate on the ground because it's not all being eaten.
Mm.
And that, of course, is not just increasing food source, but hopefully prolonging food source for certainly granivores. So just a couple of examples there where there are clear things that you can take from the data and go, okay, on protected or private land, here are some simple things we can do to help birds through times of adversity.
Mm.
Um, Same with the shorebirds, same with the waterfowl. There are examples, many examples, similar examples where simple things can be done, whether it's protecting roosting sites for shorebirds, having dog-free zones on foreshores, whether it's managing wetland habitat better, that can benefit birds in that way. And that's the beauty of generating data in this way. You not only get to enjoy collecting data and seeing some great places, you actually get to see it written up, published in the scientific literature, and used to benefit the very things that we love, which keep us going day to day.
Yeah. John, it's been wonderful to hear about this work. It's incredible, important scientific work being driven largely by volunteers. And, it's a credit to you that you've led this amazing effort across Queensland to reinvigorate bird banding as a research technique. Thank you for sharing your work with us today.
No, thank you for having me along. It's been great to chat about it.